All right, good morning and good evening to everyone who's joining us from Southeast Asia and from the United States. We're going to give everyone a moment to come in from the waiting room before we kickstart the event, but please hold tight and we'll get started very shortly. All right, so to those who are just joining us, good morning in Southeast Asia and good evening in the United States. I see we're still getting a few people coming in from the waiting room, but I'll just run through a couple logistical notes briefly before we get started, which is to note that for today's discussion, we do have live translation available in all of the local Mekong languages. So if you'd like to listen in Chinese, Burmese, Thai, Lao, Khmer, or Vietnamese, please look at the bottom of your screen for the globe and click the button that shows that globe and interpretation, and you're able to jump in and listen to whichever language you prefer to listen in. So that should be available for the entirety of the discussion today. And if anyone has questions that they would like to ask in their local language, please do feel free to type questions in local language into the Q&A box. And we can make that work using Google Translate or sometimes with help from the translators. We want to make this as inclusive as possible for an interactive discussion throughout the next hour and a half. So with that noted, I think we're starting to see a slowdown in people coming in from the waiting room. So thank you everybody for joining our discussion on Where's the Water Mekong Dry Season 2024. My name is Courtney Weatherby. I'm the Deputy Director of our Southeast Asia program, and I provide support on research and communications for our Mekong Dam Monitor, which is co-led by Brian Eiler and Alan Deceased, who are going to be sort of our star presenters on the call this evening. We're going to be discussing a number of sort of considerations about knowledge that we now have based on recent analysis on what's going on with water flow in the Mekong system. So for instance, we're going to talk through how water releases from upstream dams have tripled the amount of water in the Mekong during certain dry season months and how that is impacting the system in different localities. And we're also going to hear a bit of a forecasting based on the data that we currently have available, and as far as what is coming up for the dry season as we shift into 2024. So we're going to start with a presentation on that and on updates to the Mekong Dam Monitor from Brian Eiler and Alan Deceased. We're then going to welcome some outside discussion and commentary from two experts in the region who are visiting us before we turn things over to a Q&A. So I will just note as we're getting started, one of the things which I think will come out in today's discussion a little bit is a recent report that our team at the Simpson Center and with Alan have published. This is the Mekong Dam Monitor annual report for 2022 to 2023. You can find it online at the link that I just posted. We are going to be publishing a downloadable PDF version that all of you can access sometime within the next month or so. So please do keep an eye out for that. But we think that this gives a number of really valuable insights into what's going on in the river basin. It includes some recommendations for how policymakers and dam operators can potentially change their behavior or do more information sharing and coordination and weather forecasting to identify and mitigate some of the worst impacts, particularly in drought years. And it also runs through some really detailed analysis on the impacts of specific subsets of dams, particularly in the 3S River Basin and also on the Tonle Sap expansion process. So I'm not going to share all those takeaways with you. We hope you'll go to the report and read them. But you can read through really just sort of the first section of the report. There's about 5 pages there that are a policy brief, which will give you all of the high level takeaways. And then those who want to delve into the details of the data are very welcome to do so by continuing to read on. So with that started, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to our key commentators for tonight. So I think many of you have joined us for previous Where's the Water events, but for those who have not met them previously, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague Brian Eiler, who is the Senior Fellow and the Director of the Southeast Asia and Energy, Water and Sustainability Programs at the Simpson Center. Brian is an expert on transboundary water issues and other issues in the Mekong region, and also on China's economic cooperation with Southeast Asia. And most importantly for tonight, he is the co-lead with Alan of the Mekong Dam Monitor. And he's going to be joined in presenting sort of the key points for our Mekong Dam Monitor by Alan Deceased, who's his co-lead on the Dam Monitor and also the president of Eyes on Earth. And Alan has 40 years of experience working in climate sciences, in particular with NOAA, as well as the insurance industry. So Brian and Alan, I'm happy to turn things over to you both.
Thanks, Courtney, and welcome everybody. Alan, are you ready to go?
Yes, we are.
Okay, all
And
right.
we've got a lot to say, and we're going to keep on moving.
We do. So welcome everyone to our seasonal Where's the Water briefing. We hope that this briefing looks back at the previous wet season and answers some of the most important questions about what happened over the course of the wet season. And then we're going to move into the dry season. And I like the position that we're in here, at the beginning of the dry season after the wet season, because what happens in the wet season ultimately affects the dry season of the Mekong. And there's a very clear relationship that starts with the wet season and how dams restrict flow during the wet season, and then how they release water during the dry season, and that affects dry season flow. So we're excited to give you a review of the past wet season and forecast into this current dry season. Importantly, we're through looking at this data that we produce and publish and connect with data produced from the Mekong River Commission. We're beginning to see some. Obviously, we've been finding the severe impacts of dams for 4 years now, since the dam monitor has been launched. But we're seeing some climate change impacts too, and importantly, the dam impacts are kind of masking the climate change impacts. You have to be able to find the dam impacts and remove them to see how the river is flowing naturally. And that's not an easy thing to do, but we're able to do it. We're going to share that information with you and delve into how climate is changing the Mekong River, and come up with some pretty interesting and useful conclusions. Before we get into our presentation, I'm going to show one thing that's new on the Mekong Dam Monitor, and that is a new feature that we just added. You're going to see some of this data during our presentation, but if you scroll down on the home page, you're going to find a new feature called How Do Dams Impact Different Points Along the Main Stream? We've got an interactive map here on the left, and the map is broken down into 5 sub-basins or 5 groupings of dams. Those groupings of dams are roughly divided based on the amount of flow that comes into the river. So you've got China's dams in one grouping. You've got dams between Changsan and Thailand and Vientiane in another grouping. Dams between Vientiane and Nakhon Phanom. These are what we call the core Lao dams. Dams like Nam Num 1, Nam Num 2, Nam Tun 1, Nam Tun 2, Tin Bun expansion. Some of the largest dams in Laos. The Thai dams in the next sub-basin down, and then the 3S dams in the final sub-basin. And we're able now to see how these groupings of dams are impacting flow. So we brought this new feature in, and you can click through it in an interactive way to both see what the dam impacts are per month and compare it to a long-term mean, a long-term average of how the river should be flowing. That's this blue line here. So if we look at, say, what happened during the Changsan wet season, we're actually going to look into that later. The thing to know is that to imagine how the river would flow, we're going to look at the top of the bars. So that is dam restrictions plus the observed flow at a gauge. The observed flow is a blue. The restrictions are the red. This is how much water was held back behind dams. So the distance between the top of the bars and this average line is really what climate is doing. That's a climate effect. That's a lack of rain. That's the amount of rain that hasn't fallen, or how far below normal rainfall is. And then when you add the restrictions on, this is what is actually observed. The blue is what is actually observed. And you can see that at Changsan in Thailand, the actual observation was really far below average. Dams made that so much worse and so much lower than average during the wet season. This is going to be updated every month. We're going to show current months in 2 seasons at a time. And you can click down through and see how, again, those groupings impact different parts of the basin. We're going to come back to this later, but I wanted to share this with you. Right now, it's only in English. We're going to get the local language translations up soon, and then also find a place to store past data on the dam monitor. Okay, well, let's jump right into our presentation. So to start, this past week, we noted that during the dry season, this is a time when dams are releasing water. There was a significant release from the second largest dam in the system. That's China's Shao'an Dam that holds about 23% of all the usable water in the Mekong. And that release that happened at the end of last week is currently raising the level of the river in Thailand. And you can see this the raising happen, play out over the hours. Yesterday, today, it's going to continue into tomorrow. And that's artificially raising the level of the river. The river is not high right now, so there's no flood risk. But at this point of the year, the river should be going down. And that drives kind of local ecologies and local community practices. But as this has been happening now for decades, typically during this time of the year, the releases happen and they're raising the level of the river. So just wanted to kind of bring us to the present before we go back to review wet season of 2023. And to kick us off as to what happened during the 2023 wet season, Alan's going to take us through a tour of temperature and wetness. Alan, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Brian, and Courtney as well for setting up and introducing the meeting that we're having here. I'm going to start with June, and I'm going to work my way through these slides to January of this year. And the colors correspond to variations from normal. So white in the middle is what's expected. Darker and darker shades of blue mean that it's colder and colder than normal. And darker and darker shades of red mean that it's warmer and warmer relative to normal. So what you can see in June is that it's quite warm. In fact, look how warm it is in the Tibet, in the upper basin in China. Extremely warm throughout the basin. And these warm temperatures help promote the early melting of the snow cover. And so that what would have normally been a major amount of snow melt was melting earlier in the year than normal. Then if we go through if we look at July and August, you can see that the temperatures remain warm up to in the Tibetan Plateau, but cool in the middle of the Mekong Basin. And then you go into September, you can again see some warm temperatures in September in the upper basin going all the way down into northern Laos. Look at October. Look how warm October is relative to normal. This is a pretty extreme event up in particularly up in China in the upper basin. And so you can see that what normally would be already freeze up beginning in October is actually quite warm. And then those warm temperatures continue through November, particularly in the lower basin, and then in the lower basin, December and January remain warm. So this is the climate signal that Brian was just talking about, that we're seeing. You don't see too many cold anomalies here. Generally, temperatures are much warmer than the long-term average. And of course, that's impacting rainfall, river discharge, and growing conditions, as well as basically surface features throughout the region. And so we can start to see some of these surface features. If you look in June, remember I said how warm it was. Well, it's also very dry because usually it's melting snowpack in June, but the snowpack is long gone. And so it's much drier than normal in the upper basin because of these warm temperatures. July is usually the snowpack is largely melted, so we don't see a whole lot of below normal wetness. It's actually some wet areas, the blue, as well as some red areas to the north. But look at all those dry areas in the southern basin. So we've got a serious, basically, you may not call it drought, but it's certainly much drier than average. And so the amount of water coming into the early part of the wet season is actually below average. That started to change in August. In August, look at those dark blues and even purple areas in northern Laos. Those areas of extreme wetness are also affecting the delta. Look down at the delta and you can see that extreme wetness is propagated all the way down. Partial of that is rainfall in the delta, but a lot of that is actually water that's flowed down through the river and starting to accumulate in the basin, in the delta region.
And Alan, if I can interrupt, if remember in July of this year when we were looking at these maps, we were really worried that all that red and dryness were going to result in another really dry wet season. Remember, we were kind of forecasting some anxiety that it looked like a repeat performance of 2019, 2020, 2021. Thankfully, the rest of the wet season didn't turn out that way.
And part of the reason is that extreme wetness in Laos, and also you see the 3S basin, which is around the Vietnam border with Cambodia there, is also blue, and so that's actually bringing in some more water into the lower basin and into the delta. So yeah, what we thought looked like the precursor of a severe drought got basically augmented by all that extreme wetness in northern Laos. But you can still see that if you look at it in September, there's more red than blue. And so this was not a wet year. Northern Thailand actually had some good moisture in October. You can see that the redness is gone in October in northeastern Thailand, but there's still quite a bit of red in Laos. But also, I really want to point out that look, now you're starting to see above average wetness in October. This is normally beginning of the freeze up, and things are not freezing up, particularly as you go into December and January. Those areas in December and January in the Tibet are usually frozen, are usually not wet. The wetness literally means there's liquid water on the ground, and it can only be liquid if temperatures are above freezing. So normally would be accumulation of snowpack is actually not, a lot of that is actually liquid water that's starting to flow into the river as well. Now, this is a dry time of year, so above average wetness does not mean necessarily a lot of water, but definitely above average wetness and corresponding with above average temperatures. And then Brian has circled, and we're going to get back to this later in the talk, but he has circled down around Cambodia. You see that area of dark blue to the south and west of the Tonle Sap Lake. He's pointing to it right now. And you can see that is not just a 1 month occurrence. If you look in November, it's persistent. And then in December, again, it's even more amplified. So, this is something that we're paying attention to, that we're seeing that the dry season seems to be delayed. I'm sorry, the wet season seems to be delayed, and the wetness doesn't start to accumulate until more into August and September. And yet it seems to be extending later into the wet season and even the beginning of the dry season, where we're seeing some of this dark blue and purple, which means much above average wetness in times when normally the wet season would be abating and basically the surface should be drying out, but we're not seeing that. Relative to the 30-year average, we're seeing a lot more wetness in November and December and January. And this may indeed be a change in climate. We don't know. It's studies that we need to do. We need to, get a lot of data and do some analysis and get some confidence that what we're seeing is a persistent and a significant trend. But we are seeing it, and this is not the first year or the second year we've seen it, that wetness extends later into the wet season and even going in towards the beginning of the dry season, particularly in the lower basin. And the last thing I'm going to point out here is that because of this wetness in the Tonle Sap Basin, we're seeing that the delta is also has above average wetness at the beginning of the dry season. So I want to stop here. We can come back a little bit more on this point at the end of the presentation.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, you're going to come back and talk about the Tonle Sap expansion and what happened with the Tonle Sap. I think one trend also worth pointing out is that all the red up in China and the upper basin throughout the early months of the wet season. That's basically a drought. And it's kind of the second year of this kind of drought. And that translates into dam impacts. So we just like every year, we watch these reservoirs, the largest reservoirs in the system, 55 large reservoirs throughout the entire basin, and use satellite imagery and remote sensing to monitor those volumes. We discovered that the Nojadu Dam, which is the largest dam in the Mekong system, only filled up to 50%. And in fact, over the last number of years, it hasn't filled up close to 100% rather frequently. I think only like 5 years out of the last 10 years, and the dam is relatively new, about 10 years old, has the dam filled to its highest levels. And that should be a concern. You know, there's a lack of water availability there. That dam, when it doesn't fill up, its impacts are less. The environmental impacts are less. So that's a boon really for the Mekong Basin, for environmental outcomes and water levels. But you know, if you're an investor in that dam, it's not making the money that it's supposed to be making. It's not generating the power that it's supposed to be making. It's an argument against hydropower, right? An economic argument saying that other alternatives probably can produce more. Large power generation projects can produce more. And if you look at a general trend, dams in China, particularly the two largest dams, once again did not fill to their highest levels, especially Nojadu, where the downstream largest dams in Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam did. And this is the second year in a row where we've observed this. The downstream dams this past wet season filled to higher levels than 2022. But again, China's really didn't. You can say Xiaowan filled in 2023 up close to its higher levels, but between Nojadu and Xiaowan, the really two large dams, they filled about the same levels. And again, that's due to a lack of water availability. Now that translates through to, again, less impactful environmental outcomes downstream. Good thing overall for the Mekong, for communities, for fisheries, for local agriculture. But I think it's interesting just to look at how China's dams have been filling, given the power that they wield over the downstream. And again, these are huge dams. They hold, the two largest dams hold about 50% of the usable water in the system. The other 9 dams don't. They're rather small, and have less impacts. But if you're looking at the amount that these dams have filled over the last 6 years, particularly in Nojadu in the blue, it's just not getting up to its higher levels. And this year, last year, 2019, we see this pattern of low utilization of that reservoir, which again begs the question of, is it worth it? Is it worth having these huge dams on the Mekong if they're not doing what they are supposed to do? Coming to look at these impacts, again, back to that data that I was showing earlier, we're going to take a walk down the river and look at how dams are impacting different parts of the river. And I have to rearrange my Zoom screen a bit so I can see these things. You know, Zoom has all these fancy buttons and whistles that show up on your screen these days. But at Chengsen, just again, how to interpret these graphs, the blue line across the top is the normal pre-dam flow. And we take 2008 prior. We take all the MRC data, 2008 and prior. We think that dams really began to change the flow of the river after 2008. So we kick out all that data and just look at kind of a pristine flow pattern of the river system and compare that to what happened. So blue, again, is the observed flow. That's what was actually coming down the river. And that's far below mean, right? Almost every month. But particularly in August and September and July, the blues are quite far below the mean. But look at September. September was a month where China's dams had some huge restrictions and almost half the flow of the river. In September, flow at Changsan, Thailand would have been near normal, but those dams halved flow. The restrictions halved flow. And you can also see here that the month to month, the kind of restrictions that China's dams have are not done in a gradual way. There are smaller restrictions, say in August and October, and then these huge restrictions in September. We're going to learn that the downstream dams in Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam kind of take a more gradual approach to their restrictions. Impactful nonetheless, but much more gradual than, say, China's dams. Moving downstream to Vientiane, we really don't see the impacts of new dams between Changsan and Vientiane. That would be like the Nam Con 2 or the Nam U dams. Those impacts don't show up so much, but China's do translate down through. They're proportionally less because it's farther downstream. Interestingly, I think it's important to focus on Nakhon Phanom. This is a gauge that's like halfway down through the river system. The impacts along the Thai Lao border at this part of the river are kind of less known, less understood than, say, the Golden Triangle, where we do a lot of work, or at Stung Treng, where so many also do a lot of work, like Chea La, who's going to be joining us talking about fisheries in a bit. Nakhon Phanom is probably one of the most impacted gauges. Why? Because the impact of the core Lao dams, as we call them, again, dams like Nam Num 1, Nam Num 2, Thun Hun Bun expansion, Nam Thun 2, the largest dams in Laos are accrued there. And those are the orange bars that you see. Those dam restrictions can be as impactful as China's dams restrictions during certain months. You can compare, say, August's orange bar, which is those core Lao dams that brought the level of the river down that much, to, say, China's dam impacts in September. Those are about the same size. So those dams can be impactful. No, at Nakhon Phanom, flow was kind of closer to the normal mean. And it's beginning to see that, again, this wet season wasn't so dry, especially farther down in the system. And that conforms with what Alan described with, a drought in China higher up in the basin, the drier it was. So the dam impacts are more pronounced. As well as the climate impacts to the river. As we move downstream, we see that the river levels and the volume is much closer to mean, but still below it. So focusing on Stung Treng, again, you can see those core Lao Dam impacts bringing down flow in August. China plus core Lao Dam impacts in September are bringing down flow to about 80% of what it could what it should be, and reducing flow by 10 to 12% during those particular months. Interestingly, this is getting back to Alan's point, October is wetter than normal. And this is the second year in a row where we've seen these higher than normal river levels in October, whereas the earlier months of the wet season are much lower. So regardless of the dam impacts, the river levels are much lower. That's something of concern, where October and November seem to be kind of very wet or normal. Just to compare 2023, which was, an okay year, was slightly below average for flows, to 2021, which was a very dry year. I think 2021 gives us good insight as to, how dams can be extremely impactful. If you look at the natural flow of the river during 2021, the peak, again, we got to look at the top of the bars here. The river peaked in Changsan in September. Normally it would peak in August, so it's peaking late at much lower levels. But the observed flow is really below average, and the flood pulse was hardly observed. Farther downstream, again, the distance here in 2021 from normal is extremely great. The Chinese dam impacts, as well as those core Lao Dam impacts, are driving down levels even more so than they would under just the impacts of climate and a lack of rain. Happy to dig into this further as we go along. I'm going to come back to Alan now, and he's going to go over the impacts of the Tonle Sap expansion. I'm going to fix that map, Alan, too. Go ahead.
Thank you, Brian. That was an excellent overview of what's happened throughout the basin as the year unfolded. What we're seeing here is basically a map that shows the expansion around the lower basin in Cambodia and down towards the Delta of Vietnam. So if we look at the very top left, we see basically the Tonle Sap Lake in the middle, and we see some green colors, which are places that can be flooded and during this time of the year, and they're not flooded for this in 2023. If we move into June, we don't see much of a change. We see we see a little bit of blue down in the Vietnam Delta. Those are places that are actually inundated according to the SAR data, which is showing water accumulating on the surface. But now let's go over to July, which is really the beginning of the flood pulse, and as it starts to its amplitude rises as the wet season gets more accelerated. So you see a lot of green area, but the green means that it traditionally is flooded, but not flooded this year. So these are areas that are actually drier than normal, and that's largely corresponding to the drought upstream. That the flood pulse has not risen to the point where you're getting an overland flooding, which happens traditionally at this time of year. We go into August and you're starting to see some of the expansion of the flood pulse, the blue areas that are inundated. So you're seeing down in around the Delta, and you're starting to see some blue areas in around the Tonle Sap Basin itself. But it really only expands to a great magnitude in September. And so a lot of areas that are now blue, which means that they are flooded and they're traditionally flooded. So these are areas in September that are basically, there's water on the surface and we can see it with the satellite observations. October, look at October, look how much blue there is. So in September and in October, the flood pulse grew in its extent and covered much of the area as it traditionally does at this time of year. So it was much delayed, partially because of the drought, dry conditions upstream. And then when you get at the end of the end of the wet season, you're seeing a lot of inundation, and that inundation extends into November. Again, we see a lot of blue area, and you can see that there's not much green in December either. That means that most of the areas that would be inundated in December are indeed inundated. So what we're seeing in synopsis is a very slow start to the wet season and a very delayed response to the reverse flow that normally happens in July, and it really only started to happen in August and then got more pronounced at the end of the wet season from September, October, November, and of course it's abating as the basin starts to dry out in December.
And Alan, for our
So,
listeners, can you remind folks why why we focus on the flood pulse, why it's important?
well, the flood pulse is important for several reasons, but one of the most prominent features of it is that it brings in the spawn, it brings in the larvae. When the Mekong rises high enough that it's above the Tonle Sap Basin, which is really a couple of meters above sea level. So when the Mekong gets mighty and it rises, 5-10 meters up, then the Tonle Sap Basin basically looks like the ocean. It looks like the coastline. It's below the level of the river. So the river pours into it, bringing in all the nutrients and the spawn and the larvae and the fish. And that's what brings in the fertility of the Tonle Sap Lake, which is the reason why it produces such a bounty of fish in which the whole Khmer culture is dependent upon for the fisheries, for the food security, and for the cultural traditions of food of fish paste, and part of the lifestyle of the people for thousands of years.
Thanks. Many benefits. I think you've highlighted probably the key benefit.
And we can see here, this is something that in the lower right hand is the Mekong River Commission has a wonderful display of the reverse flow, the water pouring into the Tonle Sap Lake from the Mekong as it rises to higher levels than the lake. So the lake becomes basically the delta to a large degree. And so what you're seeing here is you're seeing what is average, the black line. That's the average reversal over, I think, about a 10-year period. The blue line up to above it is the average, or basically the maximum extent of the reversal. And the blue line to the below the black line is the average minimum extent, and the minimum extent of the reversal. So you have the black lines in the middle, that's average. The blue line on top is the maximum. The blue line on the bottom is the minimum over a 10-year period in which this was developed. And then we're looking at each year basically superimposed upon that 10-year average. And you can see two things. You can see, as Brian has his cursor on 2022, there was basically a nominal reversal. That red line means well below the minimum from the 10-year average period. And so a nominal reversal, which means very little nutrients are brought in, the spawn's not brought in, the larvae's not brought in, and a lot of the fertility and the vitality of that normally enriches the Tonle Sap Lake is just not being provided. In 2023, you can see that it pretty much aligns with the minimum average from the 10 years prior, when it was much more representative of natural flow. So this is, and so what we can say two things: that at least it got up to what would be considered a minimum of natural conditions. But remember that if a lot of that water hadn't been held back in the lakes and the reservoirs upstream, what we're seeing as a minimum average conditions or minimum flow would be much higher. And so we'd be closer to the black line, and it would be bringing in a lot more of the bounty and the fertility into the lake, which would certainly help basically the fishing industry and the prosperity of all the communities that depend upon fishing for their livelihood. And there's quite a few people that, I don't know how many, but I think it's about 1 million.
Millions, yeah.
Yeah, that depend upon their livelihood is dependent upon the fertility and the bounty of the lake, and it's just not coming in to the levels that it normally had. And part of it is climate, and part of it is the impacts of the reservoirs upstream. Yeah, and you can see it on the image to the top, right above it, as you can see. And this is a model that we developed. And so the blue line is what we see as water that would be in the Tonle Sap Basin, what the level of the Mekong Dam would normally be without any reversal. And so only the water that's coming into the Tonle Sap River from the basin around the lake. That's what the blue line represents. The brown line represents what's actually seen at the gauge. Now, anytime the brown line is above the blue line, that's reversal. That's extra water being brought in by the Mekong. So you can see that the reversal, and we spoke about this earlier, the reversal started at the end of August. And Brian can slide it up a little bit. You can see that August is right around the time that the reversal began. If you make the slide a little bit up, you could see the legend. But then you can see all that gray area, that's the reverse flow. This is water coming in from the Mekong into the Tonle Sap Lake and bringing in all the bounty that is associated with the Mekong water. And then you start to see it draining out. So the latter part of that gray area is actually the water leaving. So we're seeing the Mekong water coming in, and then we're watching it flow out. Once all that gray area is dissipated, then the water that's flowing out is actually flowing out from water that's received not from the reversal, not from the Mekong, but from the Tonle Sap Basin itself. So this is water that's coming from the Cardamom Mountains and all the tributaries of the Tonle Sap Lake that is flowing out into the Mekong as the dry season continues. And then we can see on this slide, we can see the two things. We can see 2 years. We can see the Tonle Sap expansion and for 2022, and we can see it for 2023. And in 2022, you can see that the brown line and the blue line are pretty much superimposed on each other at the beginning of the wet season. And that means that the waters are filling the lake, not from the reversal, they're filling the lake from water that's actually brought into the lake from the tributaries around the Tonle Sap Basin. So this is not a reverse flow. The Mekong literally is rising simultaneously as the wet season brings all the water into the lake from the surrounding basin of the lake. So you're not bringing in the spawn, you're not bringing in the nutrients, you're not bringing in the larvae. Now the lake is expanding, but it's expanding from another source. Waters are coming from the tributaries, not from the Mekong. And then you can see it flowing out. The black area in 2023 is all that's water is coming out from the Tonle Sap Basin towards the Mekong and basically nourishing the delta with water and nutrients and sediments. And then you can see 2023 is very different. In 2023, we're seeing a reverse flow. And so you can see that the lake rose, but not because of waters around the Tonle Sap lake, but because of water being brought in from the Mekong. As the reverse flow basically brought in excess water as it rose above the lake and then flowed and filled the lake and expanded the lake into the grasslands and the flooded forest. And then you're seeing it flow out again.
And Alan, if I could add here, what's interesting is 2022 had a higher peak and more of an expansion. And that's reflected in your model too. You see a higher peak in 2022, but which would you say is the healthier expansion?
The healthier expansion is when the Mekong can bring in basically the nutrients and the spawn and the larvae and the fertility to the lake. So they had actually a very good fishing season this year, and they found endangered species and fish that they hadn't caught there for many years, largely because the Mekong was feeding the lake instead of the lake being fed by the tributaries around it. So even though the lake was much higher in 22, it didn't have the natural pulse and the nutrients being brought into the lake from the Mekong. It missed that basically supply of fertility. And the fishing industry it reflected that. And then we can see it very clearly right here. You can see just in synopsis, you can see that it's Stung Treng. You can see that the lake was that the river was being depressed or kept at lower levels because of the impacts of the reservoirs and what it would have normally achieved if natural flow had been maintained. And also look at October. October is actually even with the reservoirs, you can see that the lake and its Stung Trend, the river, was up to its normal levels. And that's what we saw earlier, that there's more wetness and there's more rainfall later in the wet season. And this could indeed be a signal of climate change. And so there may be reasons to hold back in the way in which reservoirs are filled, allowing more of a natural flow at the early part of the wet season, particularly June, July, and early August, allowing that pulse to raise the river, raise the Mekong, and bring in the reversal, so that all the fertility and the benefits of the Mekong reversal flow into the Tonle Sap Lake, and then fill the reservoirs later with some of the water that's coming in later in the wet season, because there seems to be more water later in the wet season and the environmental impacts would be less. And in the natural dynamics of the river, the natural dynamics of the reversal could be maintained at the time of year when the ecology depends upon it, which is in July and August, not in September and October, which tends to be more of the pattern now, where the reversal is most prominent. You saw later in the wet season and retarded earlier in the wet season.
Yeah, so this is one of our first major conclusions, is it seems like the later months of the wet season are quite wet. Dam restrictions happen during the earlier months. And if the water's there during the later months, then perhaps dams can wait to do the restrictions and give the Tonle Sap and the system a chance to initiate and take off, as you see it in this graph at the bottom. Alan, I'm going to move us a little faster because we need to catch up on time. So Can you just give us a brief summary of this, and then we'll move to our guest speakers?
Sure. And this is, we've already spoken about the pronounced features of dark blue and purple is extremely wet. So you're seeing in December and January, you're seeing strong wet anomalies to the south and west of the Tonle Sap Lake, which is that dark structure right at the outline of the lake, right in the middle of the image. And you're seeing a lot of wetness basically in December and January that normally is not there. And we can see in these lower images, the images at the bottom, this is basically, we're watching the flood pulse, and we're watching it flowing out of the Tonle Sap Basin and down into the delta. So it gives us a predictive skill as to how the water is accumulating around the Tonle Sap Basin and even upstream in the Mekong, and how that water propagates down and basically brings water and irrigation supply to the Vietnam Delta during the dry season in which they depend. And so we're watching the pulse, and we can see the movement and even have some predictive skill how much water will be moving downstreams in the weeks and months to follow.
And that's, it's a neat find that, again, there's this delayed wet season effect of the Tonle Sap draining out into the Mekong Delta, and that keeps the Delta wet in the early months of the dry season. I believe Nguyen is going to talk more about the state of the Mekong Delta, so we'll look forward to hearing from him. But just to advance our presentation and wrap up, let me just give a brief forecast of where we are now. So this is a picture of total storage of the largest reservoirs over the course of the last year, that colorful picture there on the left. And we are at the end of the line in the current position. And you can see that currently there's basically the same amount of water in the reservoirs now as there was at this time last year. That's how that bar extends across. So kind of what happened last year is going to be reflected in what happens this year. That's our first prediction. Overall, restrictions in China were lower than normal, and that's going to result very likely in a closer to normal pattern of flow at Changsen in the Golden Triangle. And you'll see these peaks and valleys. That comes from sudden releases and sudden restrictions, but at least the river won't be as high as it's been in the past. You can see that red line shows the much higher river levels when dam releases can triple flow at Changsen, sometimes do even more damage. And again, higher levels during the dry season are not desired outcomes for the Mekong Basin. They kill the ecologies, they send confused signals to fish about their migration pathways. Holidays can't be celebrated. Riverbank agriculture can't be planted. Higher levels really create a mess for the people of the Mekong during the dry season. And there are other negative benefits. As we move downstream to Stung Treng, basically, lower levels in China lower reservoir levels don't really translate through to more normal flow at Stung Treng, Cambodia. And that's basically because the impacts of the downstream dams in Laos and Vietnam and Thailand and Cambodia begin to accumulate. So I would expect a flow line that is very much above normal at Cambodia, at times can double flow or nearly double flow. And that's very concerning about the ecology of the flooded forests around Stung Treng, and it also has impacts to the Tonle Sap. So let's just leave things there, and we will end our presentation and move to our speakers. And I'm really excited to hear from Say La, who's going to tell us about the fishing season in the Tonle Sap, given that flows weren't so far below normal this year, what that meant for the fishing season in the Mekong. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Alan. So we're going to turn now, as Brian said, to Selah. And for those who don't know her from some of our previous sessions, Selah is a longtime friend of our team, and she is the project coordinator with the USAID Wonders of the Mekong project in Cambodia. And Selah has worked for over 15 years as a volunteer, a researcher, community facilitator, and coordinator and project manager on projects related to protection and management of natural resources and community livelihoods in the Mekong River system and its tributaries. So Selah, we look forward to hearing an update on fisheries from you.
Thank you, Connie. Good morning and good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Today, I would like to present you in brief about the fishery in Mekong River, especially in Cambodia. So I have a short presentation. Again, my name is Chia Selah. I'm a project manager for Wonder Mekong project that the project funded by the USAID. And the project focus on the research, training, and outreach activity that we would like to highlight the importance of the Mekong River to generation, to people, and to everyone. So as Alan or Brian have talked a lot about the Mekong River, so I would like to highlight why Mekong River in Cambodia. Because there are many fish in the Mekong, especially 30 to 70% of the fish are migratory fish. So without a free-flowing river, the fish cannot migrate to spawning or to feeding between the Mekong and Tonle Sap Lake. And this is very important that in wet season, the fish spawning and then the baby fish migrate down to Tonle Sap Lake and fatten and get bigger, and then in October the majority of the fish migrate back to the Mekong River as the habitat, and also the home, going back to home in the Mekong River, because there are many deep pools over there. So it is very important, and maybe the Mekong River in Cambodia is the last habitat to save the Mekong River fish. And based on the project, we also have a different project activity that like talked in earlier. We have research, training, and outreach. And one of the main activity, we collect the fish larvae during the fish migration, like the larva fish migration downstream in July or August. And then we nourish in the experiment pond, and when it grow up, we release fish back into the Mekong River or into the Tonle Sap Lake. And also we have the telemetry research project that we take the fish and release, so we can understand about the fish migration between one area to another area. And through the project, it's not only the research, we also we do the outreach activity. So after the project release many fish as the research, and also would like people to engage in conservation. Many fishermen, when they catch the live fish, they call us to take and release back into the river. For example, in 2022, 23, 24, we released many fish. So in total, from 2017 to present, the project released around 21,000 fish. And we got a lot of release between 2022 and early 2024 of the 16 Mekong giant catfish. So this is the key, the largest freshwater fish in the Mekong River. Even though the Mekong giant, the stingray is the largest freshwater fish, but that we caught, and we got the world record in 2022, and we got a two certificate in 2023. But this very important that the fishermen, the community, and all stakeholders engage to help us to inform when they catch the fish, and sometimes they don't need us to help, but they release fish after they catch, and they know about the endangered fish. So this is very important.
Selah, can I ask you a question? How
Yes.
common is it to find Mekong giant catfish these days?
I don't know in the past, but after I joined the project in 2022, we do a lot of release. We joined with the World Fish Migration Day. So we engage all the students, government officer like fishery administration, because we work in partnership with the Inland Fishery Research and Development Institute, university, and we engage students, we engage everyone to join the fish release. That's why when we do a fish release, we take fish, and we also engage media as well. So we try to announce about the release fish, what important of the endangered fish in the Mekong River. So when they got information or they accidentally caught, they inform us. So after that, in 2022, we got a lot of call from the fishermen. So we start to go there and release fish. And some fishermen, they release, and then they take the photo or video, share with us.
Thanks.
Yeah. So I think that I asked everyone who working with me what happened, why this year we got out information as well, because I think that the first one, the fish maybe we cannot check it's increased or not, because we don't know the total amount in the water. But the fishermen, they got knowledge. They gain the knowledge what important or benefit when they call us, and then we release. So we understand about the migration, and also the fishery administration. They also give them the appreciation certificate. So this year we handle to the fishermen through the appreciation certificate, maybe around 20 or over that. I think I like these pictures a lot. This is not a fish pond, but on the back side of the student is the Mekong River. And this is the one outreach activity and also part of the telemetry research that we give the student opportunity to release the fish back into the Mekong. So fish not only food for eating, but they also can be sell the fish by release some of the endangered fish back to the river. So thank you so much. And I also would like to thank to our partner and also the local community, local authority that involved in the project. So thank you. This my end.
Disconnected briefly for
Yes,
a moment.
I would.
Did you need
have
the
a question?
for that?
I cannot hear you, Connie.
Can you hear me, Brian? Or is my audio? Okay, sorry about that. I think my Zoom disconnected briefly for a moment, so it probably lost the PowerPoint slides just as you were finishing. Did you need me to pull them back up?
No. I think it's my end.
Okay, sorry about that. It probably timed just as you were finishing your presentation that I was kicked out. So now that I'm back, I think we're going to turn to our last commentator for the evening. So I'd like to welcome Nguyen Ngoc Quy, who's a consultant with ISET International, to join us to talk about climate and El Nino trends from this past season. So Quy holds a PhD in environmental studies from Kyoto University with a particular focus on disaster risk management and climate change adaptation. He also has over 20 years of experience working in this space on disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, nature-based solutions, and water resource management. So Quy, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and good evening, good morning, everyone. So I have some slide to some image to share about the trend of the El Nino in 2023 and 2024, and some of the observation of the rainfall in the regions, and to see that how the trend of the drought in the coming months. Here is some photo that I could share with you. First, I could like to share with you the trends of the El Nino in 2024. So the values of the El Nino, it means the anomalous temperature of the forecasted and of the forecast and in the oceans that records the value of the highest in this season is the 1.9 degree Celsius. If we make the comparison with the drought in 2015 and 2016, it is lower. So the records number of the 2016 and 2015 and 16 is the 2.5 degrees Celsius. So it's it's lower than that's the worst drought, worst El Nino in the last 10 years. And if we make with the recent El Nino in 2019, so in 2019 the highest El Nino is values is the 1.8 degrees Celsius. So in this year 2014, 2023 and 24 is just 0.1 Celsius compared to the previous El Nino. And the prediction of the El Nino in the coming months, it will be end by March of 2024, and then it's predicted that it will be shortly turned into the enso, and the enso period will be short. It will just 1 or 2 months, and then after that it will be turned into the La Nina, and the La Nina is will cause for the heavy rainfalls in the regions, including of the upstream and downstream of the Mekong Delta. So this is the the prediction in the coming month, and it means that if the drought happened, it will be come in short time. It's not prolonged drought in the coming months. Here is some satellite image from the Himawari satellite from JAXA that indicates that in the years in the last month, in January of 2024, there are very less of the clouds and humids in the Mekong pattern and Mekong upstream and downstream river pattern, river basin. Here the series of the image that I just took it seen in the last 2 weeks to show that most of the cloud is in the east part of the season, and it's not come over to the Mekong River basin. Here you can see the series of image for every 3 days. So very less of the clouds cover in the Mekong River basin, both from the upstream and the downstream. Even recently from the 21st of January, it have a front curve coming from the north to the south. And it's had some of the rainfall in the north part, the north region of Vietnam and China. However, most of the rainfall is, happen in the inland of Vietnam, in the northern part and the central. It's not come over to the in the western parts of the Mekong River basin. And we had the updates on the weekly index of the soil water fractions from last week, seeing that it is most of the places have the several dry, and some places in Laos and in Cambodia had the extremely dry. And in the lower Mekong Delta, actually, we do not have this data for running this model. So, but if we see in the rainfall pattern, we will see that the monthly rainfall here showing it's a shortly drop of the rainfall in An Giang province, in Cần Thơ city, in Kiên Giang, and in Bạc Liêu. It's mean in Po, in the upstream of the of Vietnam Mekong Delta, and also downstream. And most of the rainfall statement because that there's no rain during of the January. And in the model that we got from the GFS Global Forecast System, showing that the rainfall in the coming months will be also less than the normal in the coming months, like in January, in February, and March. So based on those of the record data and the trend of the El Nino, we can predict that it will have a short time of drought coming very soon in the lower Mekong Delta, and especially in the downstream of the Vietnam part. There will be a salinity intrusion, and we predict that it will be happen by the end of February, and continue for the whole of March. That is the period of the drought in the lower Mekong Delta. That is some of the observation and then the prediction for the coming months. And in inclusion, if the drought happen, it will be in moderate drought, or some parts will be, the severe drought, the dry, area, but it's not be, prolonged. It will be short, and then the rain will come by August of 2024. That's some of the data and information to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that sort of summary of what we've seen and what we're seeing projected for the coming months and weeks. That's very helpful. So we now have about 20 minutes left for our Q&A portion of the discussion today. And I see we've got 13 questions and many more coming in. So what I'm going to do is to try and group some of these comments and questions together. So I'll ask one or two to the panel and let them respond before we move on. And I'm going to start drawing from some of the questions that came in earlier, and then we'll try to group things by theme when possible. So I guess we've got sort of two questions for the panel, which I think are looking at that they were sort of shared as comments, but I think both of them are getting at sort of the value of comparing what's going on now with what's happened in the past. So we had one comment noting, you know, when we're looking at these charts, you were showing 2022 and comparing it to 2023 on a lot of the screens. And this commentator noted it would be much better to compare the flows in 2023 with the situation before dams upstream started affecting flows a lot. For instance, comparing with data from the 1990s would be better because that's showing that the system before we started seeing these alterations when we're talking about impacts. So could you explain a little bit about why we chose to display the data in the way we did and why we chose to compare the last 2 years? And then we have another comment or question that notes, you know, some shore nesting birds are about to start their season in the Changsen area, but there's been observations of the water going up quite a bit in the last few days. So I'm going to turn that into a question and ask you to talk through a little bit about, you know, how is that a change from normal for this season, and what might that mean for those nesting birds in the local ecosystem?
Thanks, Courtney. I'll take that. You know, when we're looking at comparisons, and the question came from Ian Baird, and he's absolutely right. You need to find a good comparison, a valid comparison of what the river should be doing. And this is why when we present averages or means, and those are the blue lines on the right charts, we're looking and trying to find a period where dams aren't impacting the flow of the river. So Ian's question or comment suggested looking in the 1990s and before. We go all the way to 2007 because after 2007, the largest dams start having major impact, particularly the Chinese dams. Shaowan Dam goes online in 2007. There are some dams built before that. They are having some impacts, but their storage isn't huge. So we're looking for the biggest data set that we can find. You can see that this Changsen light blue line is from 1960 to 2007, and we think it captures the normal situation quite well, a normal dry season pattern. And Stung Trang actually goes, the chart says 1960, but that's actually a typo. It goes back to 1912. Cambodia has great data on long-term seasonal trends, and so we're quite confident that these light blue lines represent what the river should be doing. Now, to get to Andy Stone's point about nesting birds, it's a really valid one, and we've looked at this during our past Where's the Water webinars, as well as dedicated some of our Mekong Water Data hours to looking at dry season impacts. Indeed, those nesting birds nest along the riverbank when the river is low, and these releases from China and higher than normal levels inundate the nests and kill the birds' nests, and that could happen, and that likely will happen. But we predict that the impact for this particular coming wet season will be much less, and that's going to impact those nesting birds in a lessened way than previous years. Again, because China's dams upstream just don't have as much water in them to release to create those huge shocks that can come and kill those nesting birds. There will be some shocks along the course of the dry season, though. And one of the reasons why we compare, say, 2023 to 2022, you can still see the long-term mean. That line is our long-term average. And again, it's taken from a time prior to 2008 where we think dams aren't impacting the river so much, or if at all. And I think it's interesting if you look at, say, Changsen for 2022, the light blue is actual natural flow. This is how the river would be flowing under natural conditions when you remove the dam releases for hydropower production. And that basically tracks the long-term average. So the river would have flowed very close to normal patterns during 2022. It didn't, because China had huge dam restrictions, filled its reservoirs up, and then generated a lot of hydropower to raise the level of the river, tripling it in months like March and April. And that's a severe environmental impact delivered downstream. But then looking at 2023, the impact of releases actually raised the level of the river close to normal flow lines. And I think this is an interesting find too, that under normal conditions in 2023, the river would have been much lower than the natural flow pattern would have suggested. And this is likely due to the drought that happened during the summer of 2022, and reservoir levels were low. Snowmelt was low, and snowfall was low, and therefore snowmelt during the dry season was also low, and this is resulting in lower than normal levels of the river. So there's a carry-on effect from the wet season into the dry season 2023, where dam releases actually raise the level of the river to a normal level. Now, I don't want to say that this is a positive benefit of dams. Having lower than normal levels during the dry season isn't such a big problem, but it does shed light on how dam impacts, again, from the wet season carry over into the dry season. So thanks, Courtney.
All right, thank you very much for that, Brian. So we've got a couple questions related to hydropower output that I'm going to ask. And I will just note, in most cases, I'm not going to say who is asking the question unless we know them well, or unless they put their name in the question that they're asking, just because I don't know if everyone wants their names associated with it. So we do have two questions related to hydropower. One is from our team's own program founder, Richard Cronin. The other is from Ambassador Pusotirak. So Rich asks, in regards to Xiaowan specifically, you noted that the fill level this year was at peak only about 50% of its total capacity. When Xiaowan is not filling fully, how does that relate to power output? Or in other words, if the dam's only filling to 50% of its capacity, is that still adequate to meet the designed seasonal power output? And then in a sort of associated question, Ambassador Sotirakou had asked, if the large dam just simply can't store the water that's needed to justify putting it in place or constructing it in the first place, then is there a rationale or a raison d'etre for having a dam on the Mekong? Should that be reviewed?
Great questions. Alan, I'll give you a chance to respond, but just to be sure, that was the Norjadu Dam that didn't fill up all the way. Xiaowan actually got close to normal levels during the past wet season. It has a lower than normal levels, does have a pretty profound impact on power generation. We learned last year, about a year ago, that there were power shortages in China, particularly that supplied the aluminum industry. The Nikkei Asian Review and some other major news outlets wrote about higher than normal aluminum prices globally as a result of a shortage of electricity coming out of dams in Yunnan province. Now, it didn't say specifically the Mekong dams, because there are other dams on rivers in Yunnan province, but those Mekong dams weren't filling all the way in the 2022 wet season, and that created the lack of power generation into the dry season of 2023. Again, as I said before, it questions the viability of these dams, the reliance on the power generated from these dams, the expectation that the power is going to be there, has pretty important economic knock-on effects, industrial knock-on effects, that should give us a reason to take another look at the viability and as Ambassador Sotirak says, the raison d'etre of building these huge dams. Alan, what do you think?
Well, I will make just a couple of very quick comments. And most of the reservoirs in the dams have been designed based upon long-term climate averages, as to how much water has traditionally been in the basins and how much water they should be able to hold back and fill the reservoirs and then produce hydroelectric. Under climate change scenarios, we need to be realizing that what was isn't necessarily what will be, and that we need to realize that there's a lot of probabilities that we cannot assume that the dams are going to have the full capacity economically and as far as affecting the water flow that they would have been designed to under a stable climate regime. And therefore, looking at alternative sources of energy that are more stable, in which you have a clear idea of cost benefit, needs to be weighed into the design of these dams as to what are the most effective ways to produce electricity in the future. Dams may not be the best cost benefit to the future scenario of building electric capacity in Southeast Asia.
Thank you for that, Ellen. And I'll just note as well, I think it was the IEA last year, the International Energy Agency, that did some analysis on hydropower, because it wasn't just the Mekong region that saw this drop in productivity. China, India, and Vietnam overall, including areas outside the Mekong Basin, saw ranges between 6 and 16% drops in hydropower productivity through that drought last year because of low rainfall. So this is increasingly challenging. At the same time, all three of those countries did respond by having to replace that with alternative energy. And in a number of cases, this has been substituted with renewable energy from solar and wind where it was available. So there are opportunities to use these challenges to drive further energy transition. So I'm going to share a couple of questions, and these ones are going to be mostly focused on fisheries. And I'm going to ask Selah to sort of take a first jump at answering this. So we had one specific question for you, Selah, looking at fish migration species. Are we seeing a particular decline of fish migration species due to the flow changes that we talked about in the presentation today? We also had a second question asking, when we're looking at the relationship between fish stock and water levels, can you clarify that relationship a little bit?
Can you repeat the first question again?
Sure. So the first question was in looking at sort of challenges for fish in the Mekong. Are migratory fish species particularly declining due to the changes in water flow and river level that we talked about today?
Okay. And the second one is the relationship about fish and water, right?
Yes.
Similar. Okay. So from my observation, like for example, from the project that catch, rest, and release, it's part of the Wonder or the Mekong project, that the project start collect the fish lavas. Normally, when the lava migrate downstream in July, and then the FRD team with Wonder the Mekong team collect the fish lava and rest in the experiment pond, and then we release. So from the report and from the field observation, we can catch the fish larva between 2017 to 2019 and in July. So when the water rise and then the lavas migrate downstream, we can catch in July. But in 2020 or 21, the fish lava migrate downstream late in August. And in 2022, we cannot catch the fish lava. We're not sure. We observe it between July and August, but we don't see the fish lava migrate downstream. Maybe during the 2022 or 2000. They like a fish, they like a river or flood. That's why we cannot cut the fish lava or not. This is it's still in the question that we need to looking for. And based on the research from my college, that he used the data from 2004 and 2013 based on the MRC report, the fish larva, it depends on the water level as well. So when the water level rise up between July and August, the fish larva migrate downstream, and then it will migrate to the Tonle Lake and grow up over there. So the fish is related to the water. They link it to each other. And for the fish in the Mekong River, it between 30 to 70% is the migratory fish. So without the water flow or river flow, the fish cannot move in and move out, migrate downstream or migrate upstream. It will stuck in somewhere. When the water very shallow, the fishermen easy to catch the fish. That's why based on the dive fishery that I observe from the fishery diary, between 2000 and 2022, so the fish catch it between around the 6,000 pounds to 13,000 pounds of the fish caught by dive fishery. So the dive fishery is one of the commercial fishing gear that they install to catch fish in October until February. And before there are more than along the 35 kilometers in the Tonle River, there are many rows of the fishing the dive fishery. But currently, the number of the dive fishery it less than before. I'm not sure in the total number that I forget about it, but the number of the operator decline. Mean that it depends on the fish catch. The number of fish catch less, so the operator they don't want to invest in the catching fish as well.
Sayla, question for you. You said that the dive fishery catch this year was 13,000 tons. What's a normal catch? What are some of the normal catch numbers from previous years?
This is from the fishery diary from the FBD. Between 2021 to 2022, when the water rise to 9.7 meters, so the fish catch is around 13,000.
Mm-hmm. What about before? 20 years ago, what's a normal fish catch?
Between 1990 to 2000, it when the water level at 10 meters, so the fish catch is around 11,000.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yes, but I noticed there is only one very big catch during 2011 and 2012. I think when the water rise up until to 10.86 meters, so the fish catch is around 46,000 pounds.
Wow. That was a
So
big
it's a lot during only that year. That's a lot of catch. And then followed by 2013 and 2013 and 2014, when the water rise up to 10.26 meters, so the fish catch is around 24,000 pounds. So and other year just between 10 or 13,000 pounds. Yes. And only during the dry season that you mentioned between 2020 and 2021, the water very shallow, so the fish catch also go down to 8,000 pounds. Yeah, so the fish is related to the water. Yes. Yeah.
All right, I know we're getting towards the end of our time here, but I do want to ask a couple other questions because we have a number of really good ones left. I'm going to bundle two questions about a new project in the Mekong that has been getting quite a bit of attention in recent weeks. So we have a couple questions on the Funan Teco Canal proposed for Cambodia. So one of our attendees has mentioned, within the context of the delayed wet season, does the Mekong Dam Monitor team have any insight or predictions for what might happen once the Funan Teco Canal is built? Will that contribute to a further shift in delays to the wet season? Has there been any research on what specific sectors, apart from fisheries, might be impacted by that canal, or how it will impact water flow? And are there sort of any biodiversity threats or shifts in patterns that we see because of the canal being built? You know, so essentially, what are some of the projected impacts that we might expect to occur, or which have been analyzed or studied?
So this is a great question, and probably the stuff of an entirely dedicated webinar to examining the impacts of the Funan Teco Canal. We've been looking at this recently, and again, it's quite complicated, and not much is known about this canal. But what we do know is it's going to be a 180-kilometer long canal that connects a container port here on the Mekong mainstream, comes down to the Basak channel of the Mekong mainstream, cuts down, it follows the Basak channel, and then cuts across this huge wetland in Takeo and Kandal province before making its way to the ocean. And my drawing is close, but it's not perfect. But what we do know is it cuts across this big watershed, this wetland that is very wet during most of the wet season. Originally, a lot of the scrutiny about the canal was that worries that it would rob water from the Mekong mainstream and the Basak and send it into the ocean. But the design of that canal suggests that a lock system, if it is operated properly, will prevent that from happening. I think more study can prove that, and therefore the Mekong mainstream won't be as affected. But my greatest worry is about this area here, and then farther down into the transboundary floodplain between Cambodia and Vietnam, because that canal is going to act like a dam. It has a high wall, 3 meters or so high, and flood waters from the wet season is going to move downstream through this inundated area that floods really beautifully during the wet season and provides water for all the people living in southern Cambodia and supports fisheries and natural habitats for birds and other species. And then Vietnam has built this flood corridor that brings floods down into Vietnam and An Giang province, and possibly even deeper and into, say, Can Tho and other parts of the Delta. Studies will show what that impact will be if this is cut off and the floods cannot flow from Cambodia into Vietnam. This is my greatest worry about it. I don't worry so much about the Mekong mainstream impact, but during the wet season, the river is not just a line. It's the shape of what you see here, and all this moves downstream. It moves from the Tonle Sap all the way downstream and irrigates the entirety of the Mekong Delta. So that canal is going to have a profound impact on the ability of water to flow across the shape of the river, not just the line of the river in the Mekong. So our recommendation is the Mekong River Commission needs to get involved and conduct a technical review, learn more about the canal's impacts and make those publicly known. Much more to say about this, but just a quick answer.
Thank you for that, Brian. And I know we're a little over time, and I do want to be cognizant of people's time, but I think we have one particularly good sort of forward-looking question that I'm going to ask, because I think it's a good opportunity to sort of end the conversation for the night, thinking about, you know, where there are linkages to be made and what more can be done. So we had one comment that this discussion feels siloed. The Mekong's not necessarily unique in terms of big river ecosystem-based functions, depending on seasonal pulses. And the suggestions that we made on this call to time Mekong water retention and release to simulate a more natural flow is actually something that's been well researched in other river basins, including in the USA and Canadian Columbia River Basin. So just thinking about that, thinking about ways to link some of these conversations, are there opportunities for Mekong scientists and civil society to leverage some of those existing conversations in other river basins? Is there more that can be done to sort of share this system scale, whole of basin approach to infrastructure design and infrastructure operations? And is it necessary to wait for more specific Mekong specific data to change opinions and policy, or do we have what we need to really drive this conversation forward?
Alan, do you want to take a crack at that and have the last word? You're muted, Alan.
You using knowledge from other experiences is always useful. Having insights from what people have learned in different parts of the world that are parallel to what's happening in the Mekong provides insights and better policy, better planning, and usually better consequences to the maintaining the integrity of the basin. I know in the Columbia, you alluded to the Columbia River Basin. They're starting to take out some dams, and they're starting to realize that some of the impacts have had some severe economic impacts on the salmon fisheries, into the ecology of the river basin in general, and to the welfare of the communities and the natural systems that depend upon the natural flow of the river. So learning, I know that also the Tennessee River, the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, has been managing river and reservoirs for many, many years. We can learn, and of course, many places in the world have also had lots of experience. So I think leveraging knowledge and expertise and how some of the consequences of bad planning, and then how those policies have been altered to incorporate the knowledge that's been gained through the years, could also benefit better planning and policy around the Mekong Basin.
All right, thanks for that, Alan. Well, I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us for tonight's discussion. I think it's very vibrant, and we do indeed have a number of very good questions and comments in the Q&A box, which we have not had a chance to get to. So I will share those with our panelists in case anyone wants to have some follow-up answers and conversations over email. But thank you all for joining us for this seasonal update. I do very much hope that you'll join us again in future discussions. We're going to be having a Mekong Water Data Hour discussion in February, and we'll continue to have other sessions throughout the year. And I would also very much like to thank the Mekong U.S. Partnership through the State Department, and also China Cienega Foundation for sponsoring this event and supporting the Mekong Dam Monitor. In particular, their support helps us continue providing this data and also ensure that it's accessible through translation. So thank you again for joining us. We hope to see you again soon.